In the summer of 1944, Normandy had become a crucible of desperation and chaos. The Allies, fresh from their breakout after the bloody and grinding battles in the hedgerows during Operation Cobra, were moving with a ferocious momentum. Tanks rumbled across the fields, infantry advanced through shattered villages, and the skies were filled with reconnaissance planes marking enemy positions. For the German 7th Army, what had once seemed like an organized defensive front was quickly collapsing into disorder. Over 100,000 soldiers found themselves trapped in a tightening noose of Allied forces, encircled in a stretch of land that would soon be known as the Falaise Pocket. From above, the scene looked almost unreal. A mass of retreating troops, strung-out convoys of vehicles bogged down in mud, and columns of exhausted soldiers trying desperately to find any path to safety. Hitler, from the distant comfort of his command, issued orders that could not have been further from the grim reality on the ground. He demanded that the German forces hold their positions and launch counterattacks at every opportunity. Yet the soldiers in the pocket were starving, their ammunition was running low, and their communications were breaking down. Morale was collapsing as they realized that escape would not be simple, that the Allies were closing the trap faster than anyone could anticipate. SS General Paul Hausser, commander of one of Germany's most formidable armies, faced a decision that could define the lives of tens of thousands of men. He recognized that the situation was beyond repair, that adhering to Hitler's orders would lead to total annihilation. Instead, he made a desperate choice to retreat through a corridor barely 2 miles wide, a narrow passage that would funnel his entire army into what could only become a killing ground. Every step, every vehicle, and every soldier moving toward that corridor was unknowingly heading into a carefully calculated trap. For days, Allied forces had been observing the German positions, tracking movements, and preparing for the moment when the enemy would attempt escape. Reconnaissance planes circled overhead, noting the long lines of retreating trucks, soldiers, and armored vehicles. Every terrain feature, the rivers, the hedgerows, the open fields, was mapped, analyzed, and used against the Germans. Places that might have offered cover in other battles were here transformed into deadly funnels, guiding the 7th Army toward a single point where destruction could be delivered with surgical precision. The Allies were not just planning an ordinary attack, they were preparing something unprecedented. It wasn't enough to shell the enemy. They wanted to obliterate the German columns in a single coordinated strike, leaving no chance to survive. This weapon of destruction would combine every advantage the Allies had: superior intelligence, exact timing, overwhelming firepower, and innovative technology. The artillery units had studied the German retreat patterns and knew exactly where the soldiers would be at specific moments. Calculations were made down to the minute, plotting trajectories so that thousands of shells could rain on the corridor simultaneously. The Germans had no warning, no time to dig, and no chance to maneuver. Even their foxholes, the one defense that might have saved them in other battles, would be useless against the precision and lethality of what was coming. As the pocket closed, tension mounted on both sides. The German soldiers, exhausted and disoriented, moved with a mix of fear and determination, unaware that every step was leading them into a nightmare meticulously prepared by the Allies. The commanders above them, carefully coordinating with artillery batteries spread across miles, waited for the precise moment to unleash their firepower. The stage was set for a convergence of strategy, technology, and sheer destructive force that had never been seen before. The outcome of this moment would not only decide the fate of the trapped soldiers, but would mark a turning point in the battle for Normandy, sending shockwaves through the German command and altering the course of the war in the West. The Falaise Pocket was no ordinary battlefield. It was a trap designed with meticulous care, a deadly chessboard where the Allies had positioned every piece for maximum effect. And at the heart of it all was a terrifying reality. Thousands of soldiers were about to face a barrage so overwhelming, so perfectly timed, that survival would be nearly impossible. The curtain was rising on one of the most devastating moments of World War II, a moment that would combine human desperation, tactical genius, and the cold, relentless calculus of modern warfare. The German Seventh Army was on the edge of collapse. Hausser knew that following Hitler's orders to hold at all costs would mean certain annihilation. His soldiers were exhausted, their equipment damaged or abandoned, and morale was at a breaking point. Yet the narrow corridor leading out of the Falaise Pocket offered the only chance of survival. It was barely 2 miles wide, a fragile thread of escape flanked by Allied positions that could strike at any moment. Every step through it was a gamble with death, and Hausser understood that one miscalculation could doom thousands of men. As the retreat began, chaos was everywhere. Vehicles clogged the roads, some stuck in mud or destroyed by earlier artillery, while infantry struggled to navigate through the bottleneck. Soldiers jostled for position, families fled alongside combat units, and the wounded were carried on makeshift stretchers. Communication lines were nearly non-existent, and confusion reigned in the command posts. Orders were shouted and repeated down the line, often misunderstood or ignored as panic spread among the men. Yet through it all, Hausser pressed forward, determined to save as much of his army as possible. Everywhere the German soldiers looked, danger loomed. Allied reconnaissance aircraft circled above, observing, recording, and transmitting data to artillery units ready to strike. Mortar fire and strafing runs were constant reminders that the corridor was a trap, yet the Germans had little choice. Retreating meant moving through fields under fire, through forests and open ground that offered no cover. Tanks and armored vehicles, once the pride of the German army, became obstacles in the choke point, slowing the retreat and making them easy targets. Soldiers attempted to dig in wherever possible, but there was little time, and soon the corridor itself became a tomb of confusion, smoke, and fear. Hausser himself was a figure of calm determination amid the chaos, issuing orders and trying to maintain cohesion. He knew that discipline and organization were the only things that might allow even a fraction of his troops to survive. Yet the corridor was shrinking, closing around them as Allied forces tightened their grip. For the men on the ground, it felt like moving through a nightmare. Every sound, the whine of shells, the rumble of tanks, the screams of comrades, reinforced the reality that they were walking toward a trap meticulously prepared by their enemy. The Germans had no inkling that the Allies were planning a single, devastating artillery strike that would make escape almost impossible. As night fell, the corridor was a river of suffering and fear. Soldiers, trucks, and wagons stretched for miles, moving slowly under constant threat. Ammunition was scarce, and every soldier knew that their chances of survival were slipping with each passing hour. Yet the retreat continued, driven by desperation, discipline, and the faint hope that if they could just reach the other side, life might continue. They clung to the orders of their generals, to the chain of command, and to the hope that skill, speed, and luck might carry them out of the encirclement. Hausser faced impossible choices at every turn. Some units were sacrificed to delay the Allies and allow others to pass. Roads were blocked by wrecked vehicles and abandoned supplies, forcing soldiers to move on foot under constant threat. The retreat was not just a tactical maneuver, it was a battle against time, terrain, and the relentless coordination of Allied forces who were already predicting every move. For the Germans, each moment was a test of endurance and courage, a desperate attempt to escape the tightening noose that could collapse at any instant. By the morning, the corridor had become a corridor of death. Exhausted soldiers pressed forward with grim determination, aware that survival depended on maintaining the smallest shred of order amid chaos.
Hausser himself was injured during the retreat, yet he continued to lead, his presence a crucial anchor for his troops. The German army, once proud and formidable, had been reduced to a desperate, disorganized mass moving through a gauntlet that offered little hope. The Allies were waiting, fully aware of the German plans, ready to unleash a firestorm that would turn the retreat into a catastrophe. Every decision, every footstep, and every heartbeat carried the weight of life or death, as the corridor became not just a path to safety, but a stage for one of the most devastating artillery strikes of the war.
The Allies had been watching the German retreat for days, meticulously mapping every movement, every convoy, every choke point. They knew the corridor through Falaise was narrow, predictable, and deadly, but they wanted to do more than simply block it. They wanted to deliver a strike so precise, so overwhelming, that survival would be nearly impossible. This was the moment when artillery became not just a weapon, but a calculated instrument of absolute destruction. Time on target, or TOT as it was called, was the key. The concept was deceptively simple. Hundreds, even thousands of shells would arrive on a single point at exactly the same moment, regardless of the distance from the gun to the target. It required incredible precision. Every gun had to be positioned, every round measured, every trajectory calculated down to the second. Clocks were synchronized, coordinates were verified, and crews trained to fire with exacting timing. The goal was to remove any chance for the enemy to respond. There would be no warning, no chance to seek cover, no escape from the inferno that was about to descend. This kind of coordination had never been attempted on such a scale before. Allied 15th Corps artillery units were involved, each with its own sector and assigned targets. Communication had to be flawless. Forward observers calculated ranges and angles, transmission units relayed the commands, and gunners adjusted for wind, elevation, and terrain. Even a fraction of a second error could ruin the timing and reduce the effectiveness of the barrage. The stakes were impossibly high, but the Allied planners were meticulous. They had studied the terrain, the retreat routes, and the disposition of German forces for weeks. They knew exactly where the enemy would be at specific times, and every gun was positioned to deliver destruction with deadly accuracy. The technology behind the strike was equally impressive. Shells were fitted with VT proximity fuses, a recent innovation developed at Johns Hopkins University. These fuses could detonate in mid-air, above the target, making traditional foxholes useless. German soldiers who might have taken cover in trenches suddenly found themselves exposed, vulnerable to explosions that rained down with terrifying efficiency. The VT fuse turned every square meter of the battlefield into a potential death zone, amplifying the effect of the artillery to a level that the German army had never experienced before. In the weeks leading up to the strike, the logistical effort was staggering. Thousands of shells had to be transported, stored, and moved to firing positions without alerting the enemy. The Red Ball Express, a vast network of trucks and drivers operating day and night, ensured that the artillery batteries were continuously supplied. Ammunition flowed like a river, feeding the guns that would soon deliver a moment of destruction unlike any other. Every detail, from the angle of the barrel to the timing of each shell's departure, was coordinated with almost obsessive precision. As the German columns moved through the corridor, the gunners were ready. For the men waiting behind the artillery pieces, it was a tense, almost surreal calm. They checked calculations, confirmed synchronization, and waited for the exact moment. Then, at the predetermined instant, the first rounds began to fall. Within seconds, hundreds of shells, all arriving at once, transformed the corridor into a scene of unimaginable chaos.
The precision of the time-on-target strike meant that the destruction was instantaneous. Vehicles were obliterated, soldiers caught in the open were annihilated, and the corridor, already a bottleneck of panic, became a zone of pure devastation. This was not just artillery, it was a carefully orchestrated symphony of fire, timing, and technology designed to leave nothing standing. For the German Seventh Army, there was no escape, no counterattack, and no warning. Every shell hit exactly where it was intended, with horrifying consequences. The corridor, meant to be a lifeline, had become a tomb, and time on target had rewritten the rules of artillery warfare forever. The planning, the technology, the coordination, and the human effort behind this strike all converged in a single, terrifying instant. It was the moment when science, strategy, and sheer firepower came together to deliver one of the most effective and devastating artillery attacks in history. The Germans, already exhausted and demoralized, faced an enemy who could anticipate every movement and strike with unprecedented precision. For the Allied forces, it was the culmination of weeks of planning, and the Falaise Pocket was about to witness the terrifying power of modern artillery unleashed.
The success of the time-on-target strike depended on more than just precision and timing. It relied on a combination of technology, science, and logistics that was as unprecedented as the devastation it would cause. At the heart of this innovation was the VT proximity fuse, a device so revolutionary that it changed the nature of modern warfare. Unlike conventional artillery shells that detonated on impact, VT fuses allowed shells to explode above the ground, in mid-air, raining destruction down on anything below. Foxholes, trenches, even shallow cover offered no protection. Soldiers who thought they had safety suddenly found themselves exposed to a storm of explosive force, and German defensive tactics, honed over years of battle, were rendered useless in an instant. The development of the VT fuse had been a race against time. Scientists at Johns Hopkins University and other research facilities worked tirelessly to refine the technology, testing sensitivity, timing, and reliability under extreme conditions. The result was a device that could detonate with terrifying accuracy, and when combined with the time-on-target artillery, it amplified the effect of each shell exponentially. Thousands of these shells would soon descend on the corridor through Falaise, each one a small instrument of engineered chaos. But technology alone could not achieve the strike. Artillery units needed an unbroken flow of ammunition, and moving tens of thousands of shells into firing positions was no small feat. This was where the Red Ball Express became the lifeline of the operation. A vast network of trucks, drivers, and planners worked around the clock, transporting artillery shells from supply depots in the rear to the forward positions at the front. Roads were packed with convoys, drivers navigating under constant threat from German air attacks and artillery fire. The operation ran 24 hours a day, ensuring that every battery had enough shells to deliver the most concentrated barrage ever attempted. Without this extraordinary logistical effort, the time-on-target strike could never have been executed. The coordination involved was staggering. Forward observers relayed information from the front lines, noting the exact locations and movement patterns of the German columns. Artillery units calculated the range, elevation, and timing for each shell. Telephone lines, radio signals, and runners ensured that every command reached its destination, while officers double-checked calculations and synchronized watches. Even minor errors in timing could compromise the barrage, and yet, through careful training and discipline, the American artillery crews maintained near-perfect precision. As the German Seventh Army moved through the corridor, every element of this orchestration was coming together. Observers reported movement, gunners prepared, and drivers ensured a steady supply of shells.
The corridor, already a nightmare of congestion and confusion for the Germans, was about to become a theater of destruction beyond imagination. The combination of the VT fuse's lethality and the perfectly timed shells meant escape would be nearly impossible. Soldiers in foxholes, behind vehicles, or in shallow ditches would find themselves caught in an airburst of shrapnel and fire. Every step they took brought them closer to zones where survival was statistically improbable. The human element of the operation was as critical as the technology. Gunners, officers, and drivers all worked with a level of precision and coordination that bordered on the impossible. Exhaustion, stress, and the pressure of history weighed heavily on them, yet they performed with discipline, knowing that their efforts would decide the fate of thousands on both sides. This was war at its most calculated and systematic, a blend of science, strategy, and relentless human effort. When the barrage finally began, all the elements converged at once. VT-fused shells rained down, perfectly timed to arrive together, transforming the narrow corridor into a maelstrom of fire, smoke, and debris. The German Seventh Army, already exhausted, demoralized, and desperate, was caught in a storm it could not escape. The Red Ball Express trucks ensured that the guns never ran dry, the VT fuses turned cover into death traps, and the meticulous coordination of artillery units achieved a level of precision previously unseen on any battlefield. This orchestration of technology, logistics, and human effort marked a turning point in modern warfare. It was not merely a bombardment, it was a demonstration of how science, discipline, and planning could deliver destruction on an industrial scale. For the German soldiers, it was incomprehensible, terrifying, and unavoidable. For the Allies, it was a calculated triumph, the culmination of months of planning, innovation, and execution that would forever be remembered as one of the most devastating and precise artillery operations in history.
The moment had arrived. The German Seventh Army, already exhausted, disorganized, and desperate, was moving through the narrow corridor, unaware of the storm that was about to descend. SS General Paul Hausser, wounded but determined, continued to coordinate what remained of his forces, urging his soldiers forward, trying to preserve a fraction of his once mighty army. He understood the danger. Every second in that corridor increased the likelihood of annihilation, but there was no alternative. Escape demanded courage, discipline, and a measure of luck that few would possess. Then it began. The American artillery unleashed a torrent of destruction, a perfectly timed, time-on-target barrage that delivered thousands of shells simultaneously. The air was filled with the whistle and roar of incoming rounds, each one calculated to explode in midair thanks to the VT proximity fuses. Soldiers in foxholes, behind vehicles, and even in makeshift cover were caught in a deadly rain of shrapnel. Tanks and trucks were obliterated before they could move, roads became impassable, and chaos turned to panic. The corridor, once a lifeline, had become a gauntlet of death. The scene was apocalyptic. Smoke, fire, and dust filled the air, mixing with the screams of men and the groaning of dying vehicles. Artillery fire struck with terrifying precision, leaving almost no room for escape. The German soldiers, already weary and demoralized, found themselves trapped in a nightmare they could not fight their way out of. Every attempt to move forward or sideways was met with explosions, and every second brought new casualties. It was a devastating display of military science and coordination, and it was merciless. Amid the chaos, Hausser continued to lead, his presence a crucial anchor for the surviving soldiers. Even wounded, he pressed forward, assessing the situation, giving orders, and trying to salvage what he could. Yet the magnitude of the destruction was overwhelming. Entire units were annihilated in a matter of seconds.
The corridor, 2 miles wide at its narrowest point, became a tomb for tens of thousands. The retreating German forces had been reduced to fragmented groups, some barely escaping the firestorm, others captured, and many simply gone. The aftermath was staggering. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the Falaise Pocket. What remained of the Seventh Army was shattered, its ability to resist further Allied advances effectively destroyed. Hausser himself survived, but was seriously injured, and the psychological impact on both the survivors and the German High Command was profound. The destruction of one of Germany's most powerful Western armies was a turning point, opening the path for the Allies to advance deeper into France and eventually toward Germany itself. For the Allies, it was a demonstration of everything modern warfare could achieve: meticulous planning, logistical mastery, technological innovation, and disciplined execution. Time-on-target artillery, VT fuses, and the relentless Red Ball Express supply chain had combined to produce a single, devastating moment of military effectiveness. It was an operation where science, strategy, and human skill intersected to create almost complete annihilation of an enemy force in a blink of an eye. The Falaise Pocket would be remembered not just for the destruction of the Seventh Army, but for the lesson it left in military history. Even a powerful, experienced, and highly trained army could be rendered powerless if strategy, timing, and technology were used with precision. It was a brutal but undeniable demonstration of how war had changed and how preparation and innovation could determine the fate of tens of thousands in an instant. As the dust settled, the once mighty German formations were gone, their equipment destroyed, and the survivors scattered. Hausser would carry the weight of that day for the rest of his life, knowing he had led men through one of the most lethal engagements of the war. The Falaise Pocket had become a crucible of fire and destruction, a testament to the lethal power of modern artillery, and a turning point that would accelerate the liberation of Western Europe. In the end, it was a convergence of courage, desperation, and technological brilliance, a chapter of World War II that demonstrated both the horror and the calculated precision of industrialized warfare.